Okay, gang. In this video, we're going to look at Computer System Security Part 2. Many of you know from the face-to-face classes, actually the second recording of this one, I changed microphones and it didn't work. So I'm going to go back over this. I'm hoping I'll cover everything. Be sure you pay attention to this chapter just in case I kind of missed something. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about security appliances. We're going to talk about how to install and configure security appliances, that being personal firewalls, antivirus, and host-based IDS systems. We're going to talk a little bit about hardware and peripherals like UEFI BIOS, wireless devices, and a little bit about securing USB, which is kind of a big thing now. And we're going to talk a little bit about bring your own device. This is something that is still a relatively new idea in the workplace, but it's the idea that you may have a phone or another personal device, usually a phone, that you get your corporate email on, and that's not uncommon. I'll go into it in detail, but as an example, I get my email for Northwestern on my phone. My phone belongs to me, but the email belongs to them, so what are the policies there? And as a net admin, you've got to deal with that. That's a big thing to figure out how to control that data that belongs to you, but that device that does not. So when we start talking about personal firewalls, everybody should have their personal firewall turned on. The reason that firewalls work so well is that in most networks, there are multiple locations that you hit a firewall. Like just thinking about our lab at Northwestern, there is the firewall that you hit on the campus. Then you hit the router in my lab that is also a firewall. Then if you were trying to connect to my Windows server, there is a Windows software firewall on that machine. So there are 3 opportunities for data to be blocked. There are also 3 opportunities for data to go through if it's set up incorrectly in all 3 places. But these extra firewalls tend to give extra protection. And in a lot of places, you know that outside firewall is the important one, but should something seep through, one of these other firewalls will hopefully stop it. Windows has a built-in firewall. Everything since Windows XP2 is going to have that. Though there are others. Zone Alarm is an example of one. Zone Alarm is something that you can configure and play around with. Another one is Packet Filter or IPF Firewall, IPFW. And those are the FreeBSD versions for the most part. PF is a really good firewall that you see on a lot of Unix and BSD and some Linux installations. In fact, the router that we use in the lab there is PFSense, and it's actually an HTTP wrapper that sits on top of FreeBSD that accesses the PF firewall and gives me, control over that firewall via a GUI, but it's actually running PF commands. Then a lot of your other Linux installations use a command called iptables. These are some that you probably won't see details on the exam on, but they're good to know, especially if you work in an environment where there's going to be any kind of Linux or Unix or anything. So take a little bit of time and play around with those. If you're looking for a good firewall and router at home, PFSense is one I'll strongly encourage you to look at. It's free. All you really need is a machine with 2 network cards, and you can run routing and firewalls and things with it. Anti-malware, there's no excuse to not have anti-malware on a machine these days. Windows has a built-in one that's not terrible. This is something I was glad to see that they started adding with, well, it was before Windows 10, but it's in Windows 10 and on by default. Because it does a decent job at blocking things. But there are definitely other suites out there that you will most likely encounter in a corporate world. Symantec, McAfee, Kaspersky, these are just some. I'm a fan of one called Avast, just to add to the mix. And, for a home user, it's a little different. You're not doing a lot with these, but the corporate versions of these are very useful because they allow things like remote updates of the signatures. And with group policy, you can set it where you cannot turn these off. So you're able to go in and do some things to keep people from modifying them. So basically, again, it's that idea we talk about a lot of least privilege. You don't let your users have control of anything. You control it because that's sort of your job. And then, lots of places now, especially small offices and home offices, you'll have a device at home, and maybe it's your cable modem, but it's also a router, it's a firewall, it's a 4-port switch, and in lots of cases, it's a wireless access point. These devices are actually, to the network, they look as if they are separate devices, but they're built into one device in a lot of times just to save money and make it easier to configure. So an important piece of security is knowing what an IDS is and what an IDS does. An IDS is an intrusion detection system, and it is a device on your network or software that's going to monitor everything on your network or that portion of your network, and it analyzes the data to try to identify incidents and attacks. There are really two types of IDSs, host-based and intrusion network-based. A host-based is something, of course, you're going to run on the machine, and a network-based is a device that you'll have on your network that looks out there at data. And the way that these work are either statistical anomaly or signature-based. With the statistical anomaly, this is why, going back to other lectures, we talk about having a baseline. You have a baseline of what your network should look like. And if an anomaly hits, then something's weird, then it will flag that to go back and look later. An example I often give in class is, pardon me, if you normally download, let's say, 2 gigs of data a day to your port in your office, give or take a little bit, give or take, say, 500 megs, but it's usually around 2 gigs. Then all of a sudden one day you've got 10 gigs downloaded to your port. That would be something I may want to go back and look at as the admin. It could totally be legit. Maybe you downloaded a virtual machine you needed for work. But something's weird, so I'm going to go look and see if something's going on. It could also be that your computer's now part of a botnet, and it's just sending out DOS attacks as fast as it can. Signature-based are ones that have a signature file not unlike a virus scanner signature. And when they detect data on the network that falls within that signature, they will alert that something's going on. And misidentification does happen, and that's in the form of false positives and false negatives. Generally, a false positive is usually something that a virus or an intrusion was detected when one doesn't exist. In the scheme of things, a false positive is much better. A false negative is when something has happened, an intrusion has occurred, and it does not set off the IDS. That's a bigger problem because now you've actually got something going on and the IDS didn't detect it. And there are lots of these. Trend Micro's got one, Verisys has one, Tripwire. There are tons of different IDS systems out there. Cisco has their line. Barracuda Networks is another one. You'll see lots of different versions of these. So that brings us to what is a pop-up blocker. Simply put, a software that runs that just disables ads while using a web browser. There are pop-up blockers built into Chrome and Firefox now. I'm a fan of one that runs on top that's an extension called uBlock Origin. There are others. The purpose of these is just to kind of make the screen less messy. And in lots of cases, ads are where some of this malware and things come from. So by blocking all of that, you are blocking the ability for those to go through. The trade-off is some websites now, and it is unfortunate, but I understand it, they will not allow you to pass through if you have a pop-up blocker. And the reason is that's how they make their money. If you go to a site like CNN.com, you're not paying them anything. You're looking at their stuff for free, but they're making money by those little ads that you see. It may be just a thousandth of a penny they get per ad that gets shown, or even less than that probably. But that adds up if your site's getting enough traffic. The jury is out on what the way to handle this is. I've seen different sites do different things to try to recoup their money, and I don't know. I'm glad that this is not an area I have to deal with. Some sites, for example, now will allow you to leave a pop-up on, but they will ask you for a subscription, even something low like $1 a year, if you want to view their data just to help them pay their bills. That's the thing about hosting and other things. We love all of this content on the internet, and I am a big proponent of, net neutrality and a free internet and all of that, but I do know somebody's got to pay for that stuff on the back end. CNN, yes, they make a lot of money off TV, but they spend a lot of money on running a website, so, they've got to be compensated for that. So, again, here just examples of browsers that have built-in pop-up. Internet Explorer, Firefox, Chrome. They didn't put Safari on here, but I'd be amazed if Safari doesn't have one. I personally am a big fan of Firefox at the moment. I go between it and Chrome on a pretty regular basis. But both of them have pop-up blockers, and uBlock Origin is something that can be installed on any of them. And then they say some add-ons. They don't mention, uBlock here, but they mention the Google toolbar and AdBlock Plus. I will add there again, I like uOrigin. Then you might also have a content filter. And a content filter is something that blocks certain things from loading. There are a couple of different content filters. We'll get more into those later, but generally at this point, looking at it from a security standpoint, your content filter is only blocking bad things. You might, for example, have a transparent proxy running that runs a virus scanner. And it scans, if it's set up properly, it's going to scan all the data coming in and out of your network. You'll normally put that at the edge of, your router going out so that it's one of the last things that data goes through. And all of your traffic goes through that, so that way it gets scanned. Other things that may exist are data loss prevention systems. And a data loss prevention system is just something that monitors your data and stops things that shouldn't go out. A good example of this is that if you are like a credit card company or a university, you might have a data loss prevention running on your email that looks at the email and it makes notes or stops anything that looks like a social security number from going out. Generally, you don't want to send, socials and things like that via email because it's notoriously insecure. And there are types of these just like, what we've looked at with some of the others. An endpoint runs on an individual computer and is software-based. It's going to look at, email and flow between users and things like that. A network version is something that, again, you might have a transparent proxy near your exit on your, your internet pipes. And this is going to look at the data as it's coming in or going out, mainly going out, because these are more concerned about protecting your data than they are stopping anything from coming in. And a storage DLP is usually going to be in a server room, and by server room I don't mean a small server room like you might have with a small office. They may have it, but these are generally expensive systems. You're normally only going to see these on very large, servers with racks and racks of servers, or perhaps SAN systems with, terabytes and terabytes of storage. This will be something that runs on there, and basically it runs at certain intervals, usually when the network's not so busy, and looks at the data to see if anything's there that shouldn't be. So other things that are important when we talk about security is we need to take a little bit and think about physical security. And the reason is right here, thinking about the way a computer boots, the BIOS. If a computer doesn't have physical security and I can get to it, and you haven't secured the BIOS this way, then it's very easy just to boot it up, reboot your computer onto a boot disk. And, like with Windows, all the defaults, if you don't have the drive encrypted, I can boot it with an Ubuntu boot disk in a matter of seconds and copy everything off the hard drive. So what they say here is flash the BIOS, keep it updated. That's one that I'm going to just say I personally kind of disagree with. I generally am under the impression that you should not update the BIOS unless you need to in a computer. If you'll all remember back, from the A+ class when you took it, with a BIOS update, that is the point your system's the most vulnerable because, if the BIOS doesn't go right, it can brick your motherboard. Luckily, newer motherboards usually have a backup BIOS, and after they don't detect a boot so many times, they'll go to it. But not all do. In some of the old days, actually, if you messed up a flash on the BIOS, you had to actually order a new BIOS chip from the manufacturer, or in some cases, you couldn't even take it off. You had to desolder it from your motherboard. But there are some things you can do that are easy. Put a BIOS password on. That is by no means foolproof. Um, any of you again from that had the hardware class with me, one of the things we did was showed you how to change that jumper to reset the BIOS password. And Dell, they make that easy for text, but it's also a hit to security because it's always a blue jumper, and it's usually the only blue jumper on the motherboard. However, by putting a BIOS password, you are buying time. If you do have good security, this is something someone can't do quick. If they got to get in your server room, open your server, take the BIOS jumper off, boot the machine, get what they want, and then put the jumper back on, that's going to take more time. You might also consider using a hard drive password. This is encryption that a lot of different BIOS manufacturers now allow you to do outside of Windows or whatever OS it is. You can encrypt the hard drive. Now, there are pros and cons to that. We won't get into a lot of them here, but one school of thought is that that's good. You're adding some encryption there. You're doing it at a hardware level. That's great. If I come in and steal your hard drive, I can't read it. The other side of that is, though, you can't necessarily and easily move that hard drive into another computer because you have now encrypted it with a BIOS. Should something happen in your motherboard fry, you're going to need to find the same type of machine, usually with the same version of BIOS that you've got on it, in order to read that in another computer. Now, they're working on some standards and things for that. They're just not quite there yet. And another thing that they mentioned, disable external ports and devices. USB is a super easy way that people can, boot a machine. And one thing you can do is just disable all of the USB ports on your machine. Some BIOS like Dell, and I'm picking on Dell because we have a lot of those, but I know a lot of others. They have settings where you turn off in the BIOS, if you turn off the ports, only devices that are mice and keyboards will work when they're turned off. Now, when you take the CEH class, you'll learn that that's kind of an issue because you can make a device that looks like a keyboard that's not, and that's one way to hack a machine. But for now, we can say that that's a good way to at least add some security. I know in some installations too, where they really want security, they'll go in and physically unplug those from the motherboard. Most motherboards like these Dells and others where you have USB in the front, they're run down with a cable to the motherboard, and you can just physically unplug that from the motherboard and leave just the ones in the back plugged in that have, keyboards and things in them. And if you are running just Windows, you might look at Secure Boot. UEFI 231 and higher will support that in the BIOS. Issues with that become if you're looking at multiple operating systems. If you dual boot a machine, for example, between Windows and Linux, or like my personal machine in my office, I boot between Windows and Ubuntu and then Kali, 2 versions of Linux and 1 of Windows. I cannot use Secure Boot because it doesn't work with all 3. They don't all play nice, with each other with things. But if you're going to be a pure Windows environment, this is another way to add some security to your system with UEFI boot. So other things to worry about are configuring and securing storage devices. For example, block the removable media. Use encryption to protect anything you put on removable media. There's a good place for using things like, tapes. Tapes are, even today, we think about hard drives, people still use a lot of tapes. A very common backup strategy is called disk-to-disk to tape. And what that is you'll have a server in your server room that has big hard drives in it. Maybe not super fast drives, just a lot of space. And every day your system will copy, all of your servers will copy their data to that backup server. And then maybe once a week that server will write that data to tapes. Tapes usually take a very long time to write. But then you'll take those tapes and you can take them off-site. So you've got a backup somewhere else. Just as an example, we did this at LSUS. We had a disk-to-disk to tape, and we backed up to the hard drives to the backup server every night. But then we started and we wrote the tape backup starting on Friday. And the reason we didn't do a tape backup every day is even with just LSUS, that tape backup took about 90 hours to complete. So it ran all weekend into the early part of next week, and then somebody would take the tapes and physically put them somewhere else so that it was more secure. Other things you should look at, data encryption. There's no reason to not have encryption at this point. Authentication with network attached storage, you always want a log of things. Again, this may not be something you need at home. If you've got a NAS attached to your machine at home where you're just storing movies and files and things, not such a big deal. But in a corporate environment, you want logging of everything. You want to know who's accessing things and when. If you are a Windows, again, a full Windows shop, you might look at BitLocker. BitLocker is a great little thing that runs in Windows that uses your TPM module on your motherboard, and it will give you whole drive encryption. You have to type a password at the beginning when you boot the machine, and until you type that password, you can't go any further. It's a Windows-only thing, though, and there are pluses and minuses to that and that line of thought. And then you may also have specific hardware security modules in some devices. For example, there are types of network cards that you can purchase that instead of encrypting things using the CPU on your motherboard, which takes processing time, they have their own encryption built onto them so that it basically, it's called offloading. It offloads that processing to where the device itself is doing it. I'm using a network card as an example. There are others. I know there are hard drive modules in it for encryption and things, but I'm more familiar with the network cards. And basically, again, this network card's just got a little CPU on it, and it's doing the math that's involved in all the encryption and decryption instead of that being pushed onto the CPU. That gives the computer CPU more time to actually do your processing, where it offloads all this, for the network. Other things you should consider, encrypted wireless. This is 2018. There's no reason that you should not have an encrypted wireless network. It used to be that the standard wasn't there and not all the devices accepted it, but now everything you have ought to be WPA2 AES, and if it's too old to support WPA2 AES, you probably should consider getting rid of it. There are other methods of wireless, and we talk about them in some of the other classes, but basically WPA2 is the best thing right now, and you really want to do that. And not only that, you want to use a strong encryption key. They suggest 256 bits or higher based on what devices you've got and how much processing power you've got behind them. You may even want to go above that. You may want to go to an AES 512 or 1024. Much larger key, much more processing, but more security as well. Another piece of this puzzle that is somewhat new is securing mobile devices. And generally, we're not just talking about mobile devices that you own as a corporate entity, but we now allow people to access corporate networks using their own devices. And the reason for that is it does give a bit of an increase in productivity if they can get things after hours. I'll use myself as an example. My university email comes to my phone. I may not always answer it right away, but I can look at it. And if I've got a test that closes at midnight and somebody's trying to take it at 8 o'clock and they can't get into it, I can see that on my phone. I can go, and deal with that. Whereas if I didn't have email on my phone, it would only be when I get on the computer and look, and that's not always as often. Other things, that can happen is that our phones now are just as powerful as small computers. Again, I'll use myself as an example. I just got a Pixel 2 XL not that long ago, and this thing's got a pretty powerful little processor in it. It's not unlike a small computer. And they can be vulnerable to malware and botnets just as easy as other devices. This is why, you have to, when you put an app on either of the stores, the Google Play Store or the Apple Store both, even if you're giving that app away, they charge you a good chunk of money. And the reason for that is just this. They're trying to protect against malware and botnets. when you upload an app to one of those services, and you know they both have different names for it, but essentially both doing the same thing. Somebody takes your code and reverse engineers it and looks at every single thing it does. And before they approve putting it on the store, they try to make sure that it's not doing anything it shouldn't. You know, that is, again, why you're paying for that. This is also why, though, you see lots of free apps that have ads in them. Those ads may not even be making the developers very much money. They're just paying for the cost to have that app up there on the App Store. Other things that can happen with a mobile device. Most of our mobile devices, now not all, but most still use a SIM card. And if a SIM card is in a phone, you know, a SIM card can be cloned. They are not hard to get out of most phones. If you've got a, you know, your phone probably came with a little tool, but if you look at that tool closely, it just looks like a straightened out paper clip. You can take a paper clip and pretty easily pull the SIM out of a phone. And if you've got you know, the proper device to clone it, you can clone that in a matter of seconds, stick it back in and turn it back on. And then you've got a copy of that SIM cloned, so you put it in a phone that's on that same network, and you basically will receive everything that phone receives. Most phones have wireless in them now, and I don't mean like carrier wireless, Verizon, Sprint, whatnot. They've all, you know, they've got those for the different networks. But most phones now are, you know, at least in, if not AC network compatible. And because of that, they are prone to wireless attacks just like a computer can. One of the biggest issues with a phone, too, is always that it is just an easy device to walk off with. You have to think about how you're going to protect it against physical theft. You know, you can. It's so easy to lay a phone down and walk away from it and not think about it. In fact, you know, I used to be really bad about that. And luckily, I wear a watch now, a Pebble, that's a smartwatch. And there's an app that I've put on it that if I walk very far away from my phone, it'll vibrate to warn me that I've done that. And I truly appreciate that because I'm bad about it. If you don't lock your phone, that's a super bad problem because somebody can have access to a lot of your data very quickly. Not only your personal data, but thinking about this from the standpoint of you know, a net admin at a place, as bad as it is, the truth is I'm not worried about your personal data. I'm worried about the corporate data that's on your network. So, you know, I want your device protected from that. Bring your own data device concerns. Again, those are things that are out there. With lots of sites now, like if you download your email from Northwestern and use Outlook to get it on your phone, you have to agree that the net admins can remotely wipe that data off of your phone. And the reason for that is, yes, it's your device, but it's their data. You know, it's when it comes to a university, especially as an example, those are things that are part of the academic record. So that's got to be stored for so long and all, but it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the university. Which, as a side note, is also why you're often told, even if you have a professor's personal email or something, if it's a grade concern or anything like that, it needs to go through official NSU email so that it's you know, part of the log. And then finally, educate your users. One of the biggest things about mobile devices is showing people how to use it. Show them how to put you know, a passcode on it. Teach your users to not use the passcode that's their birth date or something, you know, a number that would be easy for people to guess. Simple education will go a long ways. Explain to your, you know, your wonderful old secretary who's been there a while that 1, 2, 3, 4 is not good. Explain to her why that's not good. So in this chapter, you will find 8 true-false questions and 6 multiple-choice questions. You'll find a couple of labs. I'm hoping the labs are running better for you. Get in there and take a look at those. There's some good ones. Review the key topics. Look at the terms. Again, look at that real-world scenario. I want to encourage y'all to view those and think about answers to those. And, you know, the end of chapter questions. That's it, everybody. Thanks for watching.